Alright, how is everybody? Getting ready to start the stream? But what? Yeah, I really like Obsidian. I've used it a little bit before, but I haven't like really jumped into the full scope of it. I might do that at some point for my own world. yeah. I mean, yeah, use the printer. So if you've been following along, as the the intro for the stream said, we are. I was supposed to have a D&D game today, but that got canceled. So now instead, I figured to jump in and do a little streaming. I've been working on this dungeon creation system. I've had it around for a long time, but now it's almost 2 years old. So I figured I'd give it a little revamp, get a look at it, and so I figured what better way to do that than while I'm working on it to see it in action. Start doing like maybe a little simple dungeon design. We'll see how far we get. And if people like it, maybe I'll come back and finish it off, because I'm not sure that we'll get it done in one sitting while I'm talking through it. But yeah, that's sort of the things. Thanks everybody for tuning in. If you have any questions or want to talk about anything, just drop it in the chat, take a look at it, and I'll clear things up which are unclear, because again, this document's pretty much written for my own use. So if you were saying anything that doesn't make any sense to you, it's just because I'm not communicating it really very well, and I can explain it if need be. So yeah, this is sort of the document we have over here on the left, talking about sort of this dungeon creation and sort of my ethos when it comes to creating dungeons, which is not to make them totally random, but at the same time, I don't want to plan out every single step. I like to use some randomization in it. So it kind of talks about how you can use sort of that randomization and using the human mind sort of together to get sort of the best of both worlds. And basically the document layout, and I need to put this in here. There's another section at the very end, dungeon miscellany. There we go. So yeah, so it's kind of broken up into primarily 3 sections, which is sort of the background and setup for creating the dungeon, kind of understand what the dungeon's all about before we actually start building it. Then basically figuring out all the gears, all the parts that go into the dungeon. And then we do the mapping and putting it all together, so kind of figure out what the layout of the dungeon is, and then how all the disparate pieces sort of fit into it. And in the end, I have sort of a dungeon miscellaneous section. And that's primarily for if you, for whatever reason, want to run a fully randomized dungeon, which has fully randomized effects. So it's really great if you want to do sort of like that funhouse dungeon, old school death trap dungeon kind of thing, where things don't necessarily make sense from one dungeon chamber to the next, and why hallways wrap around and go nowhere, and all dead ends and all that sort of stuff. So if you're into that, those random things in the dungeon miscellany are super helpful for that, and it's going to create a very weird sort of dungeon for you. But for me, I like to keep it relatively logical, so I kind of use basically the random tables and the random elements of it to make sure that I don't keep creating basically the same dungeon over and over and over again. Just to be able to give it enough randomization, enough spice, enough flavor to make each sort of dungeon independent and unique. And that's what we're looking for, while still maintaining that sense of this seems like a real place that we could go adventure in, that has real creatures in it, real interacting with each other. So I guess unless you guys have any questions, we'll just kind of jump right into it, talking about sort of the dungeon background and the setup. Just kind of get straight into it. Of course, I'm going to kind of walk you through all of it. So I'm not going to sit here and read the whole document, but I'll kind of hit the highlights as we kind of go through it. That is very hot coffee. I think I burned my tongue a little bit. Alright, so let's kind of jump in. So basically there are 3 dungeon types. and that's all there really is. There is what we call the complex dungeon, which is not that it's difficult, but that it is a place, a sort of facility. It's a place where creatures live and or work together, usually to produce something or mine things. Right? Examples I have are, a fortress is like that. A mine, if you want to do that. If you just want to kind of get abstract, and you can make basically an entire settlement into a dungeon as sort of a point crawl, and do it that way. The second type is natural structure, which is the one that we're probably the most familiar with from D&D and other sort of fantasy dungeon delvers, right? We have caves and the Underdark and sort of dense jungles, if we abstract that out, in forests. We have, like, if you want to do a dungeon that's inside an astral destroyer or something like that, you could do that sort of thing. And the third one that we have is the vault. Let me swap over here so you guys can get a look at what I'm looking at. There we go. So yeah, we are right here talking about natural structures. And then the third type is the vault. And a vault basically means it is an outer shell that protects something at its core, right? And the vaults basically come in two flavors, but they're essentially the same other than their intent. And the intent is whether it is a prison, whether it's trying to keep the thing on the inside from getting out, or it's a haven, which is trying to protect whatever's inside from people on the outside. Right? It's very different if you want to hide like a magic item to make sure that it doesn't fall into evil hands. Right? You're protecting it from people on the outside. Whereas if you're saying, locked in and trained up like a lich or something that you've got caught in stasis, right? You are trying to protect what's inside from getting out. And those are the two differences. But as far as dungeons building and what goes into it, they're essentially the same. It's basically just you trying to figure out which way do the traps and locks face. That's basically the only difference between them. So those are basically the three fundamental types of dungeons. So the first thing that we get to when we're talking about sort of the background of the setup for the dungeon that I like to do is kind of try to figure out who made this dungeon. Right? Who is the creator? And the creator could be somebody who physically creates it, right? If it's a settlement or a fortress or something like that, like people create those things, right? They build them. If it's something natural, then it may not necessarily have creators. And in that instance, we think about either that they're unknown or there is none. So instead, what we would consider the dungeon creator is probably just sort of the first inhabitants of the dungeon. So one of the examples I have down here is a warren created by dire rabbits, right? That would definitely be a natural structure, but I don't think we would necessarily call dire rabbits, a brood of dire rabbits, the creators, right? Yes, they created it, but it's not what we think of when we think about like a complex as a place that's built by people. It's really much more natural and organic in fashion. So I just want to build a simple dungeon. We'll get to that point and sort of like the differences in the complexity of dungeons. But so first off, I think we're just going to roll this 1d12 and kind of figure out who our creator is for this. And again, if you guys have any questions, just drop them in chat. I'll take a pause and get a look at it. But until then, let's figure out. Okay, so a 5. Do we like that? Okay, so it's a Fey dungeon. Okay. Right on. Interesting. And then after that, we have a few questions that we want to ask about the creator so we can kind of figure out who they are and what they're doing. Okay, who are they? Are we talking about like one Fey creature, sort of a group of them, like an entire faction, if you want to say that? If we were looking at sort of something like, say, a fortress, it could be a fortress that's part of like a giant empire, right? So you would think of the empire as a creator rather than just some random baron or something like that. Alright, so who are they? Are they one creature or a family? I don't think it's going to be an entire faction. Since we're building a simple dungeon, it's not going to have a ton of chambers in it. So I'm thinking maybe just one creature. One Fey creature. Let's just go ahead and we'll drop that in for now, and maybe that'll change as we answer some other questions. So the great thing about the process is that you can always go back and make amendments and changes as you need. Alright. Okay. What are they doing here? Okay, so now one of the things that we do want to figure out is, where is this dungeon? Now, normally if we were playing an adventure, right, we'd know where we were going to stick that dungeon. But since we're just kind of creating it in a white room, just kind of pick a spot. Let's say someplace maybe a Fey creatures aren't super known for going, sort of a biome. I think I'm gonna do. Let's do like an Arctic. I like that. Let's do like maybe a tundra. Okay, so they are in tundra. Okay, so it's located in the tundra. Why would they choose? Why would this Fae choose to build it in the tundra, in the cold? Why would they choose to choose in the cold instead of some place that's more sylvan, verdant, like a forest? Maybe they're like an outcast, maybe like that. So they want to be alone. So they've maybe built this sort of Superman-esque Fortress of Solitude. That'd be kind of interesting. Alright. And how do they build or co-opt the environment to their purpose? Alright, so we're talking about a Fey creature. And they want to be alone. So I guess we could figure this. It's not necessarily... We could consider it a complex, but I think that this is going to be more of a vault haven type of dungeon, right? They're trying to protect themselves from the outside. So I think that's going to be what it is. Okay, so they're trying to protect themselves from the outside. Maybe from other Fae? Potentially? Okay. Yeah, maybe they're not just an outcast, maybe they're wanted for some reason. It could be something like a unicorn kind of thing, right? Necessarily where some part of their body, horn or skin or blood, has some sort of magical property that other creatures want to get their hands on. And so they created this sort of barrier around themselves to kind of protect themselves. That could be interesting. Alright, so how do they build or co-opt the environment? There's not a ton of plant life as far as Fae are concerned in Tundra. That's one of the reasons we chose it, right? Maybe, and I mean, if we're gonna go one toe into the Superman thing, we might just go jump in both feet first. Let's say this is like full on. Maybe instead of built from like ice or snow, maybe it's a glacier. I like that. Or maybe instead of a glacier, it's an iceberg. So it's actually not attached to the land anywhere, because they felt like that would best isolate them. Okay. So it's basically a hollowed out iceberg. Interesting. Like that. It's kind of cool. So you can kind of see already that just basically having these questions and figuring out who the creator is has already made us kind of an interesting dungeon. We don't know anything else about the dungeon except sort of where it's located and what it's made out of, but that's already, and who made it, and that's already strange and weird, right? That's already very different. Alright, so, well, that answers our 3 questions that we kind of have lined out. And if I needed to, I could roll on this 1d8 chart. It's really useful if you kind of get stuck, right? Random tables are super good for that. If you get within your own mind and you don't know exactly what to do next, so you're just like, I roll on a table. And if you roll on the table and you're like, I don't really know how to interpret it, right? You are the arbiter, right? We are the human element. We get to be like, I don't know how to do that. I'm going to roll again to get something that sparks my imagination. That's what the tables are here for. And that's how they function in this dungeon design, dungeon creation sort of process. The idea is that it's supposed to get you thinking, not necessarily make you beholden to random results that you end up rolling. So we don't necessarily need to do this dungeon purpose, but just for fun, let's see what would happen if we did roll a 6. All right, that puts us at crypt, right? Should be different, right? That would put us in a very different sort of idea. So it would be where maybe like Fae laid their own to rest or something like that, which in itself would be a very cool dungeon. But I feel like we've already kind of developed one theme. Let's go ahead and stick with it. Kind of gives us an interesting dynamic creator as well. But at this point, we don't know if that creator's still around, which is what we're going to talk about here in Dungeon Inhabitants. So I think it's really great if you could make about 1 to 3 factions for most dungeons. I think any more than 3, if you get into sort of like the Caves of Chaos area where you have so many factions that are working together, it's kind of hard to keep everything straight or try to figure out why these creatures, factions who all don't like each other, are all living next door to each other. It's like having a neighborhood of enemies, which is very weird. But 1d3, kind of figure out who it is. Hopefully that'll be relatively small in ours, but we can roll that. So I'll just do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, just one faction. Perfect. So we've got factions. Alright, so we also have this D20 roll, and as you can see, from 15 to 20 is the dungeon creator. So since we only have one faction... Right, yeah. No, you're right. They're all passive-aggressive factions. Yeah, I like that golden glow. Yeah, I like that all. They're all frenemies, right? They're all Mean Girl style. I mean, I think if I was going to run Keep on the Borderlands, that might be what I do. I might run them as just sort of a Mean Girls kind of thing, where they all just kind of talk bad about each other behind each other's backs. That would be really fun. Yeah, so because we have the dungeon creators at 15 to 20, and we only have one faction in the dungeon, there's actually a high likelihood that whatever we end up rolling is not going to be the dungeon creator. So whoever our Fae is that wanted to get away, got away so well they're not here anymore. But let's make sure that we don't roll a 15 or better. Okay, well that's an 18, so we don't have to worry about that that particular circumstance, because our one faction is indeed the creator. It is in fact the dungeon creator. And so one of the important things to remember about factions is that it's not necessarily, even though we kind of identify as basically one Fae, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are the only creature in there. So one of the things we talk about with factions is that the dungeon inhabitants should include, of course, the main sort of bulk of whatever that faction is, in this case one Fae, but also includes all the sorts of like allies and tools and pets and other sort of affiliated creatures. So I think the example I have down here is, if you want to think about the faction of Dwergar, that could include Darrow, Steeders, which are the spider creatures they use for like mounts and labor, the constructs that they make, and Grimlock slaves or some other Underdark slave that they can use. Yes, or they are just one creature and a bunch of clones. Again, yeah, that'd be another very fun. I could see that being a very cat and mouse sort of dungeon that you create, where it's like you keep chasing down split versions of the same one, trying to find the real one. if I was going to run something like that, I'd definitely have like a classic Hall of Mirrors sort of encounter and do that. That would be a lot of fun. Try to do like a skill challenge / combat during it, which would be really fun. So yeah, so just because we have the one Fae doesn't necessarily mean that is going to be, there's only one creature that's going to be in this entire dungeon, because that's probably not going to be the case. In fact, it's highly unlikely that's going to be the case. All right, in this case, we don't have to worry about missing dungeon creators, but just in case, we do have a table about that. This is a D8 table. It talks about like sort of ways they might not make it through, whether they abandon the dungeon. One of my favorites is they were smoked by a godlike entity. That's a lot of fun. Right, internal conflict, external conflict. Could be one of the inhabitant factions just wipe them out, which is a very easy and clean way to get rid of the creators, especially if you have a very warlike faction that ends up in the group, in the dungeon. Oh yeah, absolutely. So I said at the beginning that this specific dungeon is just kind of working at. I'm revising sort of these dungeon creation guidelines as I'm making them, and I have my D&D game canceled tonight, so I figured I'd just jump in and just kind of walk it through and just kind of give it a dry run, just to kind of see how it is. So no intent to use it as is for the stream, but it is something that, I mean, if we end up with something good. I definitely look at using it and saving it for another game down the road. But as for right now, it's just purely academic, unfortunately, because I'm not running a game right now. I am playing in 2 games. So unless I get to a point where we finish this off and I'm running a one-shot or something like that, pretty much just going to be playing games and then using things like this, because these are the things that I work on in the background. Just for my own use and to kind of sort of put it out there. So if you see the website down at the bottom of the screen, you can go check that out. I've been doing content for D&D and other D20 systems for a little over, I guess, 10 years. So, just kind of sharing knowledge, kind of getting it out there for people. So you guys should definitely check that out if you have the chance. There's lots of good stuff in there from many, many years of work on it. So one of the next things we want to talk about is dungeon condition. So that tells us, it kind of gives us insight as to the age of the dungeon, which is incredibly helpful, and it also gives us a balance on whether there are going to be a lot of tricks and traps, or there's going to be a lot of hazards and obstacles from like sort of decay of the dungeon. So let's roll that real quick. It's a d6. All right, so we got a 4. So it's in disrepair. Which means that there should be about 4 hazards or obstacles per every 1 trick or trap. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't a bunch of tricks and traps in the dungeon. It means that they're not functioning properly, is what that means. Which could be a lot more dangerous than a trick or trap that's doing the thing that it's supposed to do. Like, if you see a spear trap, you know what the spear trap's supposed to do. But if the spear trap's not doing what it's supposed to do, it's in a lot of ways more dangerous than the actual spear trap. Yeah, it could be a lazy fake creator, but it also tells us maybe a timeline. So maybe this iceberg dungeon's really, really old. And that's why the creator's not here, and all the things that they've created to protect themselves are kind of falling apart at this point. Because they've moved on for whatever reason. Right? They could be dead. If we had missing creators, right? They could be dead. But they're here. And then dungeon's in disrepair. So maybe there's a reason for that. We don't know that yet, but maybe we'll find out what it is. Maybe the creator's been incapacitated in some way. Could be one of those trick dungeons where the party gets to the end of it and they accidentally release the thing that they were supposed to not release. Right? but we do know that it's disrepair. And then I like this one at the end, which is uneven wear, which is where if we were making a larger dungeon that had a bunch of zones, if it had a bunch of zones, a bunch of different levels, where we would start rolling for those individually, where there would be like parts of the dungeon that are really well kept, and other parts of the dungeon that are completely falling apart. And so that kind of tells a story about the dungeon. Yeah, you're starting to get the mental picture for it. Exactly. Right? That's the whole point of doing the setup. Is like once we kind of get that background understanding of the dungeon, anytime that we're trying to figure out what the dungeon looks like, once we actually get into the mapping portion and laying things out, things will make more sense. And also, it's really helpful, or I find it very helpful when I'm running, if I know the background of the dungeon inhabitants and the creators and the dungeon itself. Whenever my players ask me questions about it, I'm like, oh yeah, absolutely, you can tell this, or you're not sure, or maybe, right, I can kind of point them in the right direction, and they're not going to ask me a bunch of questions. So I'm going to be like, I don't know, because I hadn't thought about that. The idea is to get us to think about it, because as we think about it, we'll understand more of it, which will, in its own way, is the bulk, I think, of DM prepping for a D&D or Pathfinder or whatever game you're playing, is just thinking about it, right? As long as you're thinking about it, you're going to be a lot more prepared than just, throwing together a dungeon really quick and then not necessarily knowing what to do with it once you hit the table. once the players start interacting with things. Let's see. So that's sort of the end of the dungeon setup. We know a little bit about the creator. We know about the inhabitants. We know about what the dungeon is, what it's made out of, where it is. So we have some pretty good questions and about the condition of the dungeon itself. So we kind of have some finishing questions that we can kind of knock that off. Oh yeah, full of constructs that look and talk about how great the creator is. That's very funny. That could be really fun. Like I was lonely and made a bunch of clones of myself. Yeah, and somewhere else the creator is very dead. That's got a very dystopian sci-fi feel to it, doesn't it? It's almost Blade Runner-esque, which is very cool. And I definitely enjoy sort of mixing sci-fi elements in with the fantasy. I not necessarily want to run a bunch of D&D games with laser guns in them and flying cars, but I do like the themes that sci-fi has. It talks about like transhumanism and things like that, which I think is very easy to layer onto something like liches and things like that. People who are looking for existence beyond sort of flesh and things of that nature. All right, so so the first question that we have for our dungeon setup, sort of at the end, what does the creator need to survive? What do they need to survive? Because it's a fey creature, it's inherently magical. So I'm not sure they necessarily need things like heating and food. They'll have plenty of water. They live in an iceberg. But I'm not sure that they need any of those things. What would they need to thrive? Maybe companionship, right? They might need companionship to thrive, which is what we were kind of talking about a second ago with the constructs. But we have also said that this place is in pretty bad disrepair. So there may be a bunch of broken constructs around that all look like it, and they're all sort of fans that are self-made fans of our dungeon creator. Yeah, variant of a Fallout. Yeah, very much like that, right? Magical power source to feed some kind of addiction. Maybe. I like that. And I think we could definitely go with that if I had chosen a glacier instead. But since an iceberg by nature is floating, I don't know what sort of power it would necessarily be tapping into, unless there could be something inside the iceberg, right? Icebergs are very old, right? They were once part of glaciers, so maybe there's some ancient creature or power source that was frozen over and rhyme from ages gone by. I like that. So they're basically, that's not how you type. Alright, let's, instead of suckling, that's a little bit weird. Let's say siphoning. Power from a source trapped within the iceberg. Which is really nice. Right? I feel like that's definitely part of the same faction, and this is definitely one of the things where you could let your players kind of stumble around, and you let them stumble around and actually unearth that evil that's buried within, or whatever this powerful thing that's trapped within, because we don't necessarily know. I mean, if there's power going through it, it must be in some sort of way alive, or is otherwise sort of a limited resource, right? Could be interesting. All right, who or what will serve as a quest giver for the dungeon? Why should our party go to this dungeon? I mean, the first thing that jumps to my mind is having this sort of siphoned power force. This power source is causing some sort of mayhem. Well, we've got a fey creature. We talked about their, being on an iceberg and not having sort of greenery. But what if the power source, kind of using the fey as a conduit, is making the area, this tundra, surprisingly lush, right? It's got a ton of vegetation in it. I kind of like that. I kind of like the idea that, or it's disrupting the balance of nature, right? It's disrupting the environment. So let's say, the power through Fey is disrupting it. Could be right. Could be a solution to a different power somewhere else, right? And that's definitely one of the things that I look at when I'm trying to transition between adventures. Is I look for ways to sort of tie those adventures together. So it could be a case of where they would go through the dungeon and they'd find the power source, and then the next one they come across an adventure where they end up needing a power source, so they go back and get it and bring it back, and that can be sort of its own sort of mini adventure along the way. I think the power working through the Fae is disrupting the environment. I think it's doing basically, I think it's going to be, let's say, microscopic, maybe like microscopic global warming. And I think that is melting a glacier, which is threatening to wipe out a village in a valley. Wipe out, or let's say a village in a fjord. That'd be fun. That's a very easy way to get somebody, to get adventurers on board, to like, hey, figure out why all the ice is melting around this. It's been this way, for 500 years. Why is it suddenly melting all over the place? And there may be this gigantic ice sheet that's at the top of the valley of the fjord, and they know like it's close to bursting. If it does, like, that glacier's gonna slide through the valley and kill everything in it, basically. I like that. Which makes it very clear, right? We know what the quest giver wants. They want themselves and their families and their homes not to be destroyed. And we know what problem the dungeon is causing. Okay, why hasn't anybody completed this quest? Well, they might not know what the source is. It's clear they don't know what the source is, so they probably need somebody with some sort of magical assistance. So the village needs kind of the source of the warning. I think that's clear. And I'm not going to worry about quest rewards right now because, again, we're just kind of doing a white box dungeon creation. But if I was, like, I'd know what level the party was going to be, and I'd be able to figure out what that was going to be. Something that would sort of, like, pique their interest based off of knowing who the characters are and what they care about and, you know, what their needs are as a party. But I don't know that right now, so we're just going to skip it. Which kind of brings us into our next section, which is figuring out our dungeon chambers and stocking. And stocking. We definitely have a break here. Alright, so I talked a little bit about the 5-room dungeon design, which I love. If you guys are new to playing and or running D&D, I would definitely say go check it out, especially if you're a new DM and you need to make dungeons, or you just need to make a dungeon in like 30 minutes. That's definitely the process that I would say use. Is probably the easiest way to make a fully functional dungeon that's going to have a litany of challenges, that's going to hit basically all the pillars of the game. And so they're super useful. What they're not useful is if you continue to use them over and over again, people pick up on the formula very quickly, especially players. So it's something you don't always want to do, but it's definitely, if you're new and you're kind of trying to figure out how dungeons work, how to put them together, I'd definitely say check out the 5-room dungeon design. I mean, you can find it; it's plastered all over the internet. So what we're going to do is, right, like we have up here at the top, right here in our title, we're going to do a simple dungeon design. So simple dungeon design is basically we're going to make a dungeon. We're going to basically make chambers until we hit a boss monster. Pretty simple, which means that there's going to be 7 total creature encounters. I use the term creature encounter instead of monster encounter because it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a fight. It could be a social encounter. It could be all sorts of things. It just means we're going to have at least 7 rooms where we're going to have creatures in it. All right, and then down in here, I talk a little bit about, you know, how big should your dungeon be, and right, you want to think about like how long do you actually want to spend at the table in the dungeon as a good measure, along with how powerful do you want the characters to be, because if you kind of go off of, you know, D&D 5e, which we'll use as sort of the baseline, it's the most popular fantasy role-playing system. Their sort of bar is that a party should be leveling up about every 4 game sessions, and that's a standard sort of like 3 to 4 hour game session. So if you don't want characters to level up in the dungeon, then you know that you need to make a smaller dungeon than that. Or if you want them to level up twice, you know that you need to make twice as much dungeon. And there's a little breakdown here that talks about just sort of rule of thumbs, averaging, sort of figure out, kind of get a guesswork as to how many chambers to put in your dungeon to kind of get it to the point that you need it to be at to run in the game. We also talk about creating mega dungeons, which I talked about, like if you want a dungeon with a whole bunch of zones, a whole bunch of things, which kind of in a lot of ways feels like maybe like anywhere between 3 to 10 sort of dungeons just sort of kit bashed into each other. And so I talk about that there, but again, that's not what we're trying to focus on right now. We're just kind of doing a proof of concept, so we want to keep things as simple as possible. So the first thing we do is sort of figure out our dungeon chamber types. Or that would be the thing we're doing, but we're specifically trying to build a simple dungeon, so I kind of want to jump down to stocking, because only through stocking we'll know how many dungeon chambers we're going to make. So that's what we have those 2d6 chamber contents right down here for. Try to figure those out real quick. Well, let's start rolling some d6s. All right, 3 and 6. So we know that's going to be a hazard and obstacle. And a creature in that room. 5 and 1, so that's just going to be a creature. That's also just going to be a creature. Okay. So we need 7 creatures. Once we get 7 creatures, we know that we're done. And 5 and 6 are creatures. Alright, so this is hazard or obstacle. Now, when we roll doubles like that, or not doubles, but duplicates, we can decide whether we want that to be 1 or 2. I think I'm just going to keep it 1 as sort of a proof of concept right now. But you could definitely put 2 in there if you wanted to. Actually, you know what? I changed my mind. Just in case we can get to that sort of maybe having 1 trick or trap, since we need 4 hazards or obstacles to get there. So let's say there's 2 in that room. Alright, and now we actually roll doubles. So I'm just going to keep it the 1 creature encounter. But anytime, and I've got it down here, anytime that we roll doubles, that means there's also a treasure in the room. And this 2d6 dungeon chamber stocking is very similar to the table. It's not exactly the same, but it's very similar to the dungeon chamber stocking. I could say that. That's used in the BX mold bay. So if you guys are interested in basic D&D and expert, it's the same way that they are not exactly the same, but very similar to how they stock dungeons. All right, and then we got, so this is actually, let's go ahead and put just 1 creature, because we've already got 3, 4, 5, so I'm just going to leave 1, because I don't want to get too far into it. Just see if we can get us a few more rooms. Okay, that's another creature and a treasure. Puts us at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Alright, we need 1 more creature. It'll tell us how many we've got. Alright, 1 or 2. So it is empty. 1s and 2s mean that the chamber is empty. We got an empty room, which are nice. We don't want every room to have something in it. And then a 4 or 5, which is a hazard and obstacle. Oop, that's caps lock. And a creature, and that'll get us to 7, I believe. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. So that's how we know that's the end of since we're making a very simple dungeon, that's how we know that we're at the end. So we don't have that many rooms, which is good because we want a simple dungeon. That's why it's designed that way. That'll tell us how many we've got. Go ahead and number these for ease of use. So our little dungeon, our simple dungeon here, has only 9 rooms in it. Which means we can go back up here when we talked about our different dungeon chambers. So we've got 1d20 different chamber types, and we can kind of assign those. And these are really generic. And if we roll doubles, you'll understand why they're generic. Alright, 1, antechamber. That's easy. Antechamber and an armory. Okay. A 5 and a 6. An audience chamber and a captive area. Interesting. $11 and $20. So a knowledge area and a workshop. $7, $5. So a communal sleeping area, probably pretty solo for us, but we only have the 1 guy or girl, we don't know yet, or something in between. Looking, and level 5, right? Yes. So we have a second captive area. So we got our first duplicate. So these are set up to be really generic, so that way when we run into duplications, we can sort of drill down and make each area more specific. So we could say that different different areas of captive. So one of this might be a let's say cells. Let's say prison cells. And another thing that might be in a prison area. So maybe sort of like a prison, a yard, sort of like a larger area. Now, do we know what the creator is keeping in this prison area yet? No, not a clue. We don't even know if the stuff that's in there is alive. And we got one more. And a 14. And a recreation area. Okay. So you'll notice that basically I've created these lists apart from each other, right? It's not necessarily that this room number 1 that's got the hazard, obstacle, and creature in it is going to be the same as the antechamber. I don't know, and that's one of the reasons that the dungeon creation rules are laid out this way, is that we make those lists separately, and then when we get to mapping, we figure out which ways make the most sense to sort of put things together. But for right now, we're just sort of focused on getting the disparate elements in, and then we'll put them in the pot and mix them up and figure out how they fit together. Right? We're basically playing, basically putting together a jigsaw puzzle of the pieces, so that way when we get to the end, we have a dungeon that looks like it makes sense, like it's a cohesive whole, even though it's made up of these small individual weird pieces that we've kind of cobbled together. So the next one talks about dungeon chamber DCs, and I usually do this sort of at the end just because I'm familiar with the process, but let's just go ahead and do it here. And it's not really going to make that much difference as far as the creating part of the dungeon, but it's nice to have. So if you guys are familiar with Runehammer or Index Card RPG, which I have up on my shelf, actually it's right here. Here we go. Index Card RPG, which is a great little book. I recommend checking it out, even if you never play it. The DM section in it is exceptionally good. I've been a big fan of Hanker Infernal and Runehammer back when it was Drunks and Dragons was his YouTube channel, and you can check it out. It's a lot of fun. It's got a lot of hacks in it to help you run things better. And one of those things is sort of one room DCs. So the idea is that you set a flat DC, pretty much a baseline DC for each room, for each scene or encounter that you're playing in. So when people are like, "Oh, I want to unlock this door," you're like, "Oh, well, the room's DC is 12, so you got to roll a 12 or better to unlock the door." "Oh, well, I want to run up the wall and do a backflip over this enemy." "Okay, well, the room's DC is 12, so you need to roll a 12." And that's not for everything. He does go through a process in which you add plus three, or subtract 3 to make things a little bit harder or easier based off the circumstance. So it's not always the same. But the idea is that you set a very straight baseline. And by doing that, it makes it much easier for you to run like impartially. You don't have to spend time thinking about what the DC should be. You have a DC set already, and then you're like, "Oh, this seems hard, so I'll bump it up 3," or "This seems pretty easy, so I'll kick it down 3." Um, Actually, you know what? I'm not going to do the DCs. I have a random generation thing that I use for DCs with dice, but it's not explained in this document, and I don't really want to spend the time to explain it here. If you want to see more of it, I'm going to have a blog post up, I think, this weekend, where I start talking about sort of improvised numbers for D&D 5e. And so if you hang out and catch that when it drops this weekend, I definitely go over the system sort of in detail so you can see it. And I've noted it other places on the website throughout the blog. But if you're looking specifically for what those numbers are and how to improvise your own DCs and other numbers like damage and monster numbers and all that stuff, that's all going to come out this weekend. So keep an eye out for it. Stop by the website, bookmark it, do whatever you need to do if that's something you're interested in. So we're not going to do that right now, but we are going to do our dungeon chamber dimensions. So it's basically you roll a d12 and a d4, and that'll tell you whether it's going to be a small chamber or a large chamber, and sort of the basic dimensions of those chambers. Because that is something we'll need to know as we're building out the dungeon. So we'll just get this started real quick. Okay, 9 and 2. All right, so that's 40 by 50. These are real simple to do. And that doesn't necessarily mean that every room's a rectangle or a square. It's just kind of giving us basic dimensions. So if we want to make circular rooms or hexagonal rooms, or we want to make weird sort of L-shaped rooms or stuff like that, it just gives us the basic dimensions to make that happen. But it does not mean that every room's going to be basically a square or rectangle. All right, so we got 8 and 2, so that's 40 and 20. Another thing to note about these, and I think I've got it down in the text below, depends on, so these dimensions that we've got for our chambers are based on medium-sized creatures. So if you're going to make a dungeon, if you have a dungeon whose creators are giants, and giants are huge-sized creatures, well, they're 3 times the size of medium creatures. So the easiest way to do that is to take all these chamber dimensions and kick them up by 3. So right, that 40 by 20 that we just did would be, 120 by 60. Huge rooms, right? Huge rooms, because they're for huge creatures. And that includes sort of our corridors and hallways as well. While most, standard D&D corridors are about 10 feet across, well, if it's made by a huge creature, obviously they're going to be 30 feet wide. And that helps, in play, remind yourself and, of course, the players of, the scope of everything. Where you can be like, look, this place is huge, right? All right, 1 and 2. Oh, we got a small room. 10 by 20. I don't think we're going to have to worry about augmenting the size here. A lot of fake creatures are medium or small, so I don't think we're going to have to deal with that. Or we wouldn't if I was going to choose whatever this creature is going to be, which I'm probably not going to at this point, because it's more about the dungeon rather than who's in the dungeon. All right, 12 and 1, so 80 by 40. And that's 80 by 50. So some pretty decent sized rooms. So they're not all going to be tiny. Actually, I'm rolling a lot of large rooms. That's what it looks like. 11 and 3. Alright, so 60 by 60. Right, so again, this, since we got something like that, we could decide that maybe that's a circular room when we're mapping it, or octagonal, or whatever shape we want to make it. As long as it seems vaguely square-ish. Right, we could even make that technically a triangular room if we wanted to, which would be kind of interesting. If it was an equilateral triangle. Alright, over here. Alright, 7 by 3. 40 by 30. $10 and 1. So 50 by 40. And our last chamber dimension, 12 by 1. Again, 80 by 40. Perfect. And then after we're jumping back to where we were, where we talked about the chamber contents. So since we did that first, because we're making a very specific type of simple dungeon. But if we were doing the other way, if we were doing sort of the original method, and I wanted to figure out about how long I wanted players to stay in the dungeon, if I wanted to figure about how many sessions I wanted it to be, and whether I wanted them to level up or not, I would already have the room number in my mind, which is why we didn't do that sort of portion in this. Since we're doing the simple dungeon, we know we want to specifically get to a boss monster. It's sort of like the capstone for our dungeon. So we just needed to know how many rooms it was going to take us to get there, which is going to be 9. But under the chamber contents, we have some roll tables that help us with the hazards and obstacles. Now, it doesn't look like we're probably going to have... We only ended up with 4 hazard and obstacle rolls. But let's say, let's roll a d4 just to make sure that there's not a trick or trap in there that's still functioning. So I'll just roll... We have 4 in there, so I'm going to roll 4d4. And if I roll a 1, then that's going to be a trick or trap. Okay, so we got 2 of them, actually. Alright, so this one turned into as an obstacle and a trick or trap. So that's still functioning. And then the last one. Right, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. So this one, is actually a trick or trap as well. Absolutely. Perfect. Got it. Good. Love it. So, of course, if you have ideas for hazards and obstacles, it's very easy to toss those in there. If you're like, oh, I really like brown mold or something like that, then toss it in your dungeon. That's fine. But just in case, I have this sort of nice, easy 1d20 kind of roll for it to just kind of figure out, when I'm stuck, what is this thing? So let's just go ahead and do that for these. So we're just kind of doing proof of concept. So 7. Alright, so this first one is a permanent spell effect zone. And I'll just put it in here. That's a hazard. Because that could also be a trick or a trap. But in this case, it's unintentional, or it's some sort of weird effect that's happening. Probably from all this power that's leaking out of whatever that source is that's inside the iceberg. Alright, let's roll up our next one. Boom, boom, boom. Or... Alright, a liquid pool. Alright, so this is going to be some sort of liquid pool. Now, I specifically said liquid, so that doesn't necessarily mean water. It could be acid, it could be all sorts of stuff, right? We don't necessarily need to know that at this point. We just need to know that it's a hazard, but we do kind of want to figure out this other part. Is there a boat or a causeway, and is this liquid enchanted in any way? So these are really easy. I'm just going to roll a d20. Is there a boat? If it's high, there's a boat. If there's not, there's not. Alright, so there is a boat. Is it enchanted? Again, high is yes. No. Alright. So there is a boat. Perfect. Liquid pool. With boat. It could be an automatic boat, right? It could be... Think about... I mean, it's kind of trite to be like, hey, Monty Python, but of course, the boat that shows up on the shore, they kind of whisk them away to find the grail, something like that. It could be a self-directed sort of magical boat, or it could be a Charon. It could be sort of like a servitor who rows the boat, right? The boatman over the river Styx, sort of thing. Or it could just be a boat and you got to paddle it yourself. Or maybe there's no paddle. You have to figure out how to provide locomotion for getting it across. It'd be one of those fun things where it's like somebody's like, I took the gust spell, so I'm going to use the gust spell to get us across. And I'd be like, absolutely great use of that spell. Again, because hazards are just sort of obstacles that we place in front of the players. Well, here's the thing that's barring your path. How are you going to get around it? So we have that. Let's get down. All right, we've got our two hazards. We've got some of the other. One of my favorite ones down here is noisemakers, which is really great if you use shriekers. I love to use shriekers in natural style dungeons because they work as basically an alarm trap that lets everybody know the trespassers are moving through the dungeon, and also has the opportunity to potentially deafen characters, which is really fun. I was running a dungeon in which the party was getting chased by creatures through the dungeon, and they were running away, and they ran across some shriekers, and they nat one to save, and then one of them ended up deaf and couldn't communicate with the rest of the party and running through the darkness, and it was a whole lot of fun, giving them more challenges to overcome. Luckily, they weren't a spellcaster, so we didn't have to worry about that aspect, which could be really bad. So our next section, we talked about our tricks and traps. I'm more of a traps fan. I'm not a super big tricks fan, but depending on the type of dungeon you're making, and this is a Fey creature dungeon, so tricks might make more sense. Sort of mischief, right? And we've got two of those, so let's figure out what they are. And then I'll talk a little bit about different trap types. All right, an 8, which is a lockdown trap. Lockdown trap. And an 18, which is a mind-altering magic trick. That's very Fey. It's very fun. I'm getting a very strong inclination that this right here, that room 9, will probably end up being the boss monster room. So it may have a solo Fey in it, or potentially a Fey and some minions or mooks to go sort of along with it. And that's mind-altering magic trick, right? If we talked about, we talked about earlier in chat, maybe there being illusions of them, having that mind-altering magic trick could make that a really fun and interesting fight. Where maybe it's I cannot remember the name of the spell in which you get multiple versions of yourself. I'm completely blanking on the name of that spell. If you have it, throw it in chat, but I am completely blanking on the name of that spell. But if you set that to where that's an effect in the room, that's the magic trick, and so it's not tied to concentration or something from the boss monster, that could be really fun, right? Where more sort of images pop up every round or something like that could be a lot of fun. Kind of a pain in the butt for your players to deal with, which is we always like that. We want to make things difficult for them. We don't necessarily want to kill them, but we want to make things difficult for them. Not a ton of easy victories, but there will be some. So I said I was going to talk about the different trap types. So there's basically 4 different types of basic traps. There's the alarm trap, which we kind of talked about with the shriekers, which is basically having a trap that sets off an alarm and lets everybody know that there are trespassers in the dungeon. The second one is this one, the detainment trap, which is basically it imprisons intruders, right? It's basically like if you ever watch a movie in which somebody goes into the museum to steal whatever the jewel is or something, and then like that steel cage slams down around them. Right, exactly the same thing. But usually that also has what comes next. So you have in that same scene that we were just talking about with the in the museum, you have sort of the steel gate that slams down and imprisons the person who's actually taking the valuable item. But you also have a lockdown trap, right? You see it seals all the exits, right? Nobody in or out at that point. And that's what a lockdown trap does. It prevents ingress and egress from the location. And then the last one is the classic murder trap, right? Traps just trying to kill whoever sets it off. It's a shotgun with a tripwire, right? Its whole point is to kill whoever sets it off because whoever doesn't know it's there is clearly not supposed to be there. And I have a lot of other sort of like thoughts and theories about traps and how to use them and why it's important to make traps deadly and where to place traps in your dungeon if you weren't making sort of a random dungeon like we are. And of course, most of that stuff, again, on the blog at the website, redraggedfiend.com. Check it out, read it through. Lots of good stuff there. So that gets us through our tricks and traps. We have lots of other fun stuff in there. Teleportation tricks. So if anybody's familiar with the Tomb of Horrors and its sort of teleportation tricks, same sort of thing there, which can be very, very mean-spirited. They certainly are in Tomb of Horrors, but it's just a mean-spirited module. And also what kind of goes into... So we have some traps, so we should do our trap triggers or resets. So it's D4 for each. We'll just roll them twice. 2 at a time. Alright, so 1 and 3. So our first one is a sensor of perception, and then an automatic time. Okay, so the lockdown trap is... I'd say pressure sensitive, like they step on something. So it's a pressure plate to trip it. Or it's the same way it could be like you can use a pressure in reverse. Rather than stepping on it, it's when something's lifted off, which is, right, that's how the Raiders of the Lost Ark starts off with Indiana Jones, right? Lifting that sort of idol off the pedestal. And we said 3, so this resets automatically on a timer. All right, and then we have a trick, so let's figure out how the trick... well, it's not a trap, and I think, like we were talking about earlier, magic tricks tend to be persistent effects, rather than... They either tend to be one-offs or persistent effects, depending on what they are. As a mind-altering magic trick, I think that it's probably like the permanent spell effect zone that's a hazard. It's just something that's there, that goes on. There's not necessarily any downtime for it or time in which it resets, because it's just always going on. That'll get us down to creature encounters. So we have 7 creature encounters, and basically it's set up this way, which is a 4-2-1 sort of thing. So 4 basically normal encounters, 2 special encounters, which have some higher level enemies in it, and then our 1 sort of boss encounter at the end. So you kind of see how that works right there. So it's sort of normal, special, boss. Which is sort of the cadence that we would use if we weren't doing the simple dungeon. We're doing the simple dungeons, so we don't really have to think about that much because we're only going to have those 7 creature encounters. But we can roll for them. All right, so let's roll for our normal guys. Ooh, 6. All right, so this let's put it this here. So that's a hard encounter at the average party level. And so all of these use the hard CR, the hard basically level for creating encounters. I find that that's the most useful one for 5e. And then rather than adjusting it between like easy or trivial, easy, medium, hard, deadly, instead just be like it's always going to be we're always going to balance for a hard encounter, and instead we're gonna adjust the average party level that we adjust that encounter for, which I think works a little bit better than the way that CR and encounter building is set up raw out of the book, which I don't. Right, I think most people agree it doesn't work very well. So these guys here, so let's roll again for them. 4, so that's an easy encounter. So it's a hard encounter at one level. So let's say if we were running this dungeon for a bunch of 4th level players, so it's a 4th level party. This first encounter would be a 4th level party appropriate hard encounter. This would be a 3rd level party hard encounter. See how that works? It's a little bit different, but it has, I feel like, a much closer effect to what the intent is actually for building encounters and using the XP and CR budgets. So this is our 3rd one. So if we're following this rubric, that'll be our special. So we'll roll on that table instead. That's a 2. So it's another medium. It's another hard encounter at APL. Perfect. And our creature. So this is another easy or normal encounter. So another 4. Alright, so it's an easy encounter. I said it right the first time. And the next guy here is another normal encounter. Same thing. At -1 APL. Alright, this is another special. And a 3. Medium. Let's see. And then we have our last. And usually the way the dungeon creation is set up is that we don't have a roll table for whatever the boss monster is, because we should know based on sort of the background setup what's going to be in that boss monster arena. So we know that it's going to be basically a singular Fae. So that's going to be a boss. So yeah, singular Fae. Okay, and then we'll be like minions question mark, because I said minions earlier, and usually it's best if you're going to do a boss encounter. Solo monsters kind of suck in most editions of D&D, just because of the action economy. Everybody's pretty aware of that. So it's really helpful to give them minions to put more creatures on the board for the bad guys. But we also have the mind altering trick, and if we go with the split image, they might not necessarily need those minions because they'll kind of have baked in minions if that ends up being the mind altering magic trick we would go with. It would also be fun, but also maybe annoying for players if we made that mind altering trick confusion. Like you have to save against confusion every round, so you might end up attacking yourself or attacking one of your teammates or not doing anything, which of course would make the boss incredibly more powerful and really screw up the player side of the action economy, which would be very useful for us as far as making a challenging and interesting encounter that's going to have more legs on it. And we still need to do our treasure. But I also have a section down here that talks about, so you may have noticed, following around, we didn't talk about puzzles at all. That's not one of the things that shows up. And that's because puzzles are kind of hit and miss in the community. Like some DMs and player groups really like puzzles. Others completely hate it. It kind of depends on where your party and your friends fall in that. Is it the player character that's being challenged or the player themselves that's being challenged? I don't particularly have any problems with puzzles. I think of most non-combat encounters as puzzle encounters anyways, right? I feel like getting across that liquid pool with the boat, if you didn't have oars, like that in itself is a spatial puzzle, right? That's an environmental puzzle that you have to deal with. It's just not, matching colors or something like that, or things like that we think, some sort of logic puzzle that we think of. So I left that out because I don't know how your group plays. I don't know if that's something you and your group are into or if they're not. So, but if it is, I talk about down here that you can replace basically any trick or trap with a puzzle if you wanted to. And also put down here, since we're about to talk about talk about treasure anyways. I talk about having alternative means of circumventing puzzles, which can be really helpful if your players get stuck. So one of the treasures that we have is pocket contents, which is just, random stuff that people have in their pockets. And one of those can be it can be a clue to how to solve a puzzle, or just the solution to the puzzle. Maybe right, you've got a real dumb creature in the dungeon who just cannot remember how to do the dungeon puzzle. So they have a note that says, hey, you need to press these 3 buttons in this order. And so that way, if they feel, your players will feel great if they run across this enemy and kill him first and they just have the solution. They don't know what it goes to yet. And then they find the puzzle later. And if they remember, they're like, oh, we've got the solution. We don't have to worry about this. Or if they, bang their heads against the puzzle for a while and then you do a wandering monster encounter and they're like, we'll come back to it later. And then they find it and they're like, oh, let's go back to the door because now we know what to do there. So that's sort of the whole little spiel about puzzles. But we do want to talk about dungeon treasure because we got some of that. So first thing we want to do is figure out we've got 2 pieces of treasure. And we want to figure out what these treasures are. Roll a d20. Alright, so this first one is pocket contents. We were just talking about it. What's the second one? Okay, also, let's re-roll that. I don't want to do just pocket contents. Let's do something else. 9. Trade goods. Perfect. That's what we want to look at anyways, as far as testing purposes. So that's pocket contents. And this guy down here, that's going to be trade goods. And we have some more tables that we'll kind of run through that kind of helps us figure that out. So in pocket contents, I have a sort of simplified version here, but I have the full table in my actual DM's binder. Again, this is an article that I think is the latest article that's up on my website right now, where I start talking about making my own DM binder after how many years of playing D&D, and I literally made a DM binder for somebody else, but I had never made one for myself. So I was like, I should do that. They're super useful. But in that, I have the actual treasures that I use, the actual table that I use for pocket contents. So I'm going to roll on that instead of the simplified version, because it's a different resource entirely. Okay, so 1 and 5. Okay, lens. It's actually one of the most powerful or most lucrative things that you can find as far as pocket contents are concerned. Actually, do I want it? Alright, if I roll high, it's going to be a magnifying glass, because it's a lens, that's what it is. Alright, I rolled low, so it's going to be a jeweler's loupe. Is there an E in loop? I think so. I think it's loop. I believe that's how it's spelled. All right, and our other one was trade goods. All right. So then we have the sort of breakdown. I have a breakdown based off of, what is the actual level of your party. Let's just roll a d20. We can figure out what our APL is real quick. All right, so it's this would be a dungeon. We're gonna pretend this is a dungeon for, let's say, 4 PCs, 4 level 12 PCs. Perfect. Oh, I got ahead of myself. That was really dumb. So actually, I'm gonna, because I screwed that up. You can tell I'm still working on the system. So every time that we do a treasure packet, basically, is what one of these sort of treasure tells us, is that this is a treasure packet. So we actually make a number of rolls for treasure equal to the number of active PCs that are in the scene. So that's one. Let's go ahead and do. So the second thing we wanted was trade goods. So let's actually go back up. And let's figure the rest of that out real quick. So we need to do those again. Because I forgot what I'm doing. 8 and 14. So that's pocket contents and trade goods again. And trade goods. Perfect. And while we're here, since we're looking at this anyways, let's go ahead and do it for these guys as well. For this treasure packet. 1, 2, 3, 4. Alright. Oh, well, we're going to end up with at least 2 magical items. Nice. And 2 trade goods. Okay. Perfect. Alright. We did end up with another pocket content, so let me roll that real fast. So that's sort of not something that's on screen right now. 6 and 4. Right, so they have a note of some type. I don't know what that is. I'm not sure. Now, we say pocket contents. Pocket contents doesn't necessarily mean that it has to, come out of a dead person's pocket. It could be just, a note that's laying around, right? But it's just the treasure type is stuff that people would have in their pockets. So, right, somebody might have a jeweler's loop in their pocket for whatever reason, because it's a small thing you can put in your pocket. They certainly might have a note about something to remind themselves. Could be a list, could be who knows what. A reminder. And then we got a bunch of trade goods, so let's do our trade goods. Alright, so this tells us, treasure amount by party level, so that just kind of tells us the amount. And so you combine this amount with the denomination to figure out the worth of things. Now we didn't actually, so this treasure is not going to have any actual currency in it, which kind of makes sense for a Fae just hanging out by themselves. Right, what are they going to spend coin on? But we do know that we have a level 12 party, so they would be using the 1d50. We just need to know what type. Alright, so just do that. So only worth 7, but 7 what? 7 copper pieces. Right? They're not all great, right? It's only worth 7 copper pieces. That's okay, though. It's very swingy. The treasure's very swingy. Alright, so this is going to be worth 18 and 6, which I think is also copper pieces, right? Yeah. Sorry, what was it? 18. So these trade goods, so pretty poor trade goods so far. Especially for a level 12 party, they may not even pick this stuff up. Unless it's a useful item like paper or something like that for spellcasters or something like that, they may not even pick up this treasure because it's so low level, so low worth for a level 12 party. And this is reflective of sort of the ways that I run the game currently, is that money is hard to come by in any form, but especially in currency. But there's no guarantee, like if you plumb this dungeon for a specific reason that's not a hoard of gold, that there's going to be a hoard of gold in it. But that's because I look for players to find fulfillment in other ways in the game. Like I want to figure out, your character should have missions and things they're trying to accomplish. And yes, money helps you accomplish those things, but money and wealth by itself is not sort of the end goal for most of my campaigns. Like wealth is a tool rather than a goal. Let's roll these guys again. Our next ones. All right, so 42. Oh, 42 and 18. All right, so this one's worth 42 gold pieces, so that's better. I mean, it's still not a ton of money, especially for a higher level party. But it is, it's not nothing. We got one more. 2. Sorry, want to roll 15? And this one's worth 2 GP. Alright, pretty meager dungeon results for our level 12 party. Sorry, guys. It's not going to be a great haul, probably. Unless these magic items are real kick butt. But first, let's find out what exactly these trade goods are. Another little D20 table. $17. So preserved food. Alright. We've got some sort of scraps of jerky or something of that nature. Maybe some pickled eggs or something of that nature. And come across, and that's the sort of stuff I like to include in dungeons, just sort of like weird stuff. It's like, yeah, preserved food isn't worth a lot of money, but if you're out of rations, which is one of the things that, I think all games should do some sort of resource tracking. You don't necessarily have to like count one by one, but some sort of resource tracking. If you're out of food, coming across a stash of preserved food that's going to feed you is really important. And you may not find a lot of foraging opportunities on an iceberg, especially not inside of it. So coming across some preserved food might be a godsend in the right situation. Let's find out about the second one. These second trade goods are art or decorations. I'm going to say some sort of decoration. What would be a good decoration that's worth almost nothing? Maybe some sort of like carved little items, like carved little wooden items, like little miniatures or something like that. Or let's say fetishes. So it might have like a little carved like religious figures or something like that. That'd be kind of cool. All right. Let's get these guys down here. So this is our big one. This is the one that's actually worth something. Let's find out what this is. 12. Herbs or spices? Okay. Well, let's not leave it generic. What could that be? Uh, let's say cloves. I don't know. Cloves sounds good to me. So cloves. Those are pretty expensive. And actually, trade goods will tell us. If you ever look at the trade goods in the PHP, it kind of gives you some idea about what random stuff kind of costs. And I think I have some of that in here. So it's worth 42 gold. Oh yeah, so that's like that'd be a bunch of cloves. This cloves is in here. No, let's do saffron. Saffron's more valuable. So it's about 3 pounds of saffron, which is a bunch of saffron. If you're not familiar with buying saffron as a spice, it's very expensive for a very small quantity. About 3 pounds of saffron. Funnily enough, Saffron is the name of a fellow player character in one of the games I play in. She's a fighter. She sometimes fights. Sometimes she bravely hides behind the druid. And our final trade good down here is 19. So some sort of textile, so not worth a lot. So it's going to be probably sort of like linen. It's probably like some... it's like a bolt of linen cloth. So, do they want that? Maybe not. But if you're looking like I said, if you're resource managing, and one of your characters has a healer's kit, so you're doing resource management of that. Hey, coming across some clean cloth that you can turn into bandages to restock your healer's kit is really great stuff. Just like the saffron. Like the saffron's valuable on itself, but if you have somebody in your campaign that in your game that does a lot of cooking or something like that, they're gonna jump on that. They're gonna be like, "Yes, I want that," and they're gonna use it. And I'd probably let them get advantage on some cooking checks for a while if they wanted to, especially if they were using it with to impress NPCs or something like that. But we also have 2 magic items we need to figure out real quick. So we got that down here. So magic items by party level. All right. Well, we know we're in 12, so we know we're on this line. So we need to roll a 1d20 to figure out the rarity of the item. And we got 2 of them, so let's roll 2. Well, could have rolled once. The same number, which means they're both common. Which is good. They may be potions. They could be scrolls. We can find out. So, use this 1d20 magic item category. So if you want more information like this, so this is actually a hack or a fork off of another D&D content creator. If you're familiar with the Angry GM, he has a number of, I think it's like a 3 blog post series on making magic items have reasonable costs in D&D. I mean, there's a lot of resources for that, but I tend to like his stuff and the way he goes about making it, and this is similar to that. Is how he uses the breakdown. Whether it's a single use, a multi-use, whether the item has charges, which is mainly for staffs and wands and things of that nature, or if it's a permanent magic item. So let's figure out what those are real quick. So it's got another d20 roll. Let's roll those again. 5 and 20. Okay, so we got a single use. And a permanent. I don't really go into these. Single use, I mean, this is probably going to be a potion or a scroll, right? Those are most single use items. And it's going to be a common item, so not particularly useful for a level 12 party. That means that it's a normal potion of healing. Which, I mean, when you need hit points, you need hit points, and when it any number of hit points will bring you up from 0. So stuffing down a normal healing potion down somebody's throat while they're unconscious is still fine, still useful. Um, or it could be a scroll, which I think a common scrolls only include cantrips and first level spells. But uh, a scroll of mage armor is useful for any caster out there that uses mage armor. Right, that's one spell you don't have to cast every day. That gives you one more spell slot in the day. And I'm not gonna balk at that. Right, and then we have permanent item. That's most of the stuff. So common permanent items are the ones that came out in Xanathar's guide. Has a bunch of those. I think Tasha's has some as well. But they're all funky little things for the most part, and we could figure out one. Let's just say would be a good one. Where's my copy of Xanathar's at? Here it is. Let me grab it. I can just look at something real fast. See what's in here. If I can remember what page it's on, which I can't. Downtime, spells, counter building, magic items, common magic items, 136. It's the page where it actually lists them. Let's see, what would be a good one here? Let's see, oh, the mystery key. I like the mystery key. Maybe they find a mystery key. Especially useful if they don't have somebody who has lockpicking. And I think that's it for our dungeon chambers and stocking. I think we got everything at least fleshed out as much as we need to right now. Oh, should we do our dungeon? Let's do dungeon dressing. So let me do dungeon dressing, and then I'm going to take a short break, and we'll jump back in. Look at stuff, alright? 1, 2, 3. So dungeon dressing is just sort of like flourishes that you put in the dungeon. Just sort of extra stuff to just kind of give it a little something something. So I have a nice d20 roll table here to use it. So we'll just rattle these off pretty quickly. 4, unstable ceiling or floor. It goes with our decrepit disrepair. 18, graffiti. Let's roll a d3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? 6. Okay, roll 6. Oh, so we have some crude graffiti. Interesting. We'll have to figure out whether that's made by our Fae or if that's somebody else who wandered into this dungeon previously. 14, a benign. Let's roll a d4. So it is a benign mold. It's one of those things that's just kind of fun to throw into Dungeons and Players. If you throw like benign slimes or fungus or oozes or things of that nature, and you list it out in sort of a description, and players are gonna be like, oh no, that's gonna kill us. Let's not go anywhere near it. Or they spend time screwing around with it just to find out that it was never going to hurt them. Which is good. You want to lull them into that false sense of security, because you might have mold or an actual hazard that includes that stuff somewhere else in the dungeon, and then have them just sort of blunder into it, which can be a lot of fun. Oh, another 14. So, I mean, we already have mold, so let's make it. Actually, let's make this because we're in sort of a tundra, very cold environment. Let's make it lichen. So we'll make it 2 benign lichens. $12. Okay, distant noises. So distant noises of some creature. It's a nice thing to kind of throw in there and be like, oh, you hear things moving around in the dungeon. Just tell the party that, right? You tell your players, you can hear things moving around in the dungeon. You don't know where, based off of where you are right now, but you can definitely hear that there are things in this dungeon that are active. Which can, give them a little sense of urgency. 7, campsite remains. Okay. Now, since we only have the one faction, I do think that this campsite remains ties in very well with this crude graffiti. So maybe somebody's gone in here before. Maybe it was a previous adventuring party that was hired by the same village. Could be. Maybe we'll find their bones somewhere. Maybe that's where they find these magic items. That'd be kind of cool. Or the magic items don't come from the monsters. Well, again, this is a creature encounter. Right? And we talked in the very beginning, the creature encounter doesn't necessarily mean combat encounter. So they could come across some other adventurers that are in here. Maybe they're trapped or lost or something's going wrong with them. They could be very much a neutral party that we interact with. And of course, if you guys fight over resources, or maybe they make a deal to get that healing potion or the mystery key or whatever, right? The idea is that they have options, they have something to interact with in the room. They have people to talk to. All right, 13. Out of place furniture. So I like to think of this as like there's a random bed in the middle of, right? Let's say the armory, right? The armory as one of our rooms, and you're like, there's a random, like, 4-poster bed in the middle of this armory. What the heck's going on with that? And sure, we could come up with a reason as to why it's in there, or maybe we don't. We just let the players speculate about it. It's always fun. Maybe they'll provide us the reason if we put it out there, right? Always keep an ear sort of perked to see what, if you throw something weird out there, to see what the players throw back at you, and maybe they'll give you a good reason why that 4-poster bed's in the armory, and you're like, yeah, that sounds right. I mean, that's definitely something that could have happened. 11. Vermin. Good old vermin. Not much to say about vermin, they're vermin. Now, if you have somebody with you that can speak with animals, again, that's another sort of like cool creature encounter you can have, right? The dungeon dressing gives you sort of opportunities, some extra stuff to kind of do in the dungeon. And our final one is 10. Corpse or skeletons? That kind of goes in. I mean, we could be one of the servitors. We talked about there maybe being some servitors for this fake creature. So that could be one of the ones. Maybe that's the first thing that the party runs across, and that gives them provides them evidence that there's more adventurers still somewhere in here. And so they can we can show them that there's adventurers before they come across them. So then they're not super surprised by another party being in there. Right? It fits in with, you got the corpses, you got the campsite remains, you've got the crude graffiti they've drawn on the walls. right? It gives you a very much a feel. Maybe that out of place furniture, right? Can kind of give you a sort of idea of like what these adventurers might be like. They kind of seem like kind of jerks. But I don't know about you, but most games I play in or run for, most of the characters are kind of jerks. So they're not exactly shining paragons most of the time. So that gets us through basically the dungeon chambers and stocking portion, and now we're going to look at putting it all together. But before we do that, I'm almost 2 hours into the stream here, so I'm going to take a quick break, use the bathroom, get a drink, do all that good stuff. You know, stay with me. I'll be right back in just a little bit. All right, and I'm back. Got a little refill. Working as we do. All right, so we have reached sort of the end of the chambers and the stocking, and now we're going to look at mapping. And I think that's probably as far as we're going to get. This always takes about 3 times longer than usual when I'm talking it through, but that's fine. I mean, so far I'm happy with the way things are being put together. I maybe wish that we had a little bit more gold for our 12th level party, but you know, if you're not into a very sort of low currency, low treasure game, then you can substitute obviously your own preferred method of treasure generation. You can use the 5e raw rules, or you know, whatever treasure packet system you use for your games. So yeah, we've kind of put it together. So if you guys have any questions about any of the stuff I've gone over, or just D&D or tabletop RPGs in general, or whatever, feel free, drop it in the chat. Keeping an eye on it, try to answer those questions. I know a lot of people are kind of off tonight because the D&D movie's out. Critical Role's got the night off. Lots of things are happening for that. Usually I'd be playing a game, but game got canceled. My DM decided to go to Georgia for some reason. I didn't ask any more questions than that. I just know that we're not playing. So I figured, well, if we're not playing, I might as well kind of talk through the stuff I've been working on behind the scenes. And if you're enjoying this and you kind of want to see some other stuff that I do, I'm also streaming on Sundays, in which we're spinning up a solo 5e adventure that I'm putting stuff together. We just made the characters last Sunday and got that finalized. So we did our first session, we set everything up. The second session, we made the characters for the campaign. And so I believe the VOD's still up if you want to see the video on demand for that. If you're looking for the very first session, you'll have to jump over to the YouTube. Same call out. It's at Red Ragged Fiend over on YouTube. You can go watch that, and then that and the VOD, and you'll be caught up for Sunday if you want to join me on Sunday. If you want to know the times, you can check the stream schedule and on Twitch, and we'll go on from there. So we have set everything up as far as our chamber. We've done our background setup. We've done our chambers and done our contents for those chambers, and now we kind of want to put it all together. Usually I would sketch the map out. Do I have a sketch? I don't know if I have a sketch. Quick. Oh, I do. This is just one I was working on previously. This can be kind of hard to see. If you see down in this corner, I made sort of a point map between the chambers and how they all fit together, which is what we'll do here. Rather, I don't have anything that's going to be useful to like visually sketch it out on the screen, so I'm just gonna make basically a basic map just using the text editor right here. So the one thing that we haven't included so far, and it's the first thing we talk about in the dungeon mapping section, is the entrance to the dungeon. Ideally, we want 2+ entrances to any dungeon is usually a pretty good idea. So that way, that ensures that there is um, multiple ways for the PCs to get into the dungeon, which is always nice. And it also leaves us a way if we want to have a situation in which the villains flee or guys get away. They can use one of those entrances, especially if it's an entrance slash exit that the players haven't found yet. The party hasn't come across. And then if you want a BBEG to just get away, that's a good way for them to get away, assuming they live through the fight or run out at the start of the fight. So, but we need to determine what the entrance is. So we have down here, it's a 1d4. Off the top of my head, I would assume a elevation change, as we're talking about a dungeon that's inside an iceberg. Well, let's see what it rolls up. 1. Okay, so the entrance is just a chamber. So it's some sort of like ice building that's just sort of in the side of the iceberg or whatever. So the entrance is a chamber. We know that's a chamber. So we have our different types of chambers. So I think it makes sense, since the entrance is chamber, we don't need to add another empty chamber into our dungeon, but an antechamber works very well for that. Here. So in fact, let's swap this around. So it's the antechamber. And so what we'll do is we'll just do it this way, make it nice and easy. So the entrance goes to the antechamber. Perfect. We know that. All right. So what makes sense to connect to the antechamber? I think having the audience chamber, which is sort of a major sort of central chamber for a dungeon layout, makes sense next, and then having multiple things to sort of spawn off of that. So I think this antechamber leads directly into the audience chamber. And before we get too far, I do want to make a note down here. I've got a sort of like 10 bullet points for making better dungeon layouts that I've pulled sort of over the years from a bunch of different sources and kind of cobbled together, mixed in with my own sort of experiences building dungeons and running dungeons, that I think kind of help a lot. So the first one is that, just like with the audience chamber, right, large chambers are public rooms. That means that there's supposed to be areas of sort of high foot traffic. It's a little weird for this dungeon because this dungeon is sort of like a solo person just kind of cutting themselves off from the world. But ideally, like, those large public rooms are central, and they include sort of high traffic areas through a dungeon. Right, they should be closer to the center of the layout, and they should often have multiple entrances. Like I talked about, we're going to have a lot of spokes probably coming off of that chamber, that audience chamber. And most of those spokes are going to lead to our second point, which is small chambers are private rooms. They usually have low foot traffic. They're usually on the periphery of the dungeon, and they're usually attached to public rooms. And they do that either by being directly attached to the chamber or through a corridor that attaches potentially multiple side chambers to the main chamber. We talked about the zones and levels for grouping similar chambers together. We don't really need to do that. The only thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that our prison cells and our prison yards are probably right next to each other, because that kind of makes sense. And we don't really have anything that serves as a room that would make sense being in between those two. And again, if we think about sort of those larger public areas, so for that's probably the prison yard, and then the prison yard probably connects to the smaller, prison cell chamber, right? Public to private, fewer entrances and exits, more entrances and exits towards the more sort of center mass of our dungeon. And a lot of these are very similar to, if you follow the Alexandrian, which again, another fantastic blog. He talks about JKing the dungeon, or Jackwaying the dungeon. I don't know. I've heard multiple pronunciations of her name, and I don't know the official pronunciation. Jaquyay, and she was a designer for early D&D at TSR. She does a lot of the most famous modules and designs for them. One of the things that's common in all of her sort of modules and design of her dungeons are vertical levels of dungeons that are asynchronous. So you have level 1 that connects to level 3, but level 2 doesn't connect to level 3. So you kind of have all these like circles and weird ways to like work your way through the dungeon to get to everything, which is a really cool thing to do. But at this point, it talks about adding vertical levels to your dungeon and making sure that it's not just like one shaft that goes through all the levels. Like you have to, like if you go from level 1 to level 2, and then you have to go all the way across level 2 to get to level 3. And halfway across level 3, there's a shaft that goes down to level 1, but not level 2. And, right, that sort of idea. Which can make it seem very confusing, but also from an exploration sense and from a mapping sense for the player side, it makes it difficult to expect what's going to come next, right? Like you assume, I think most people assume when you're playing D&D and you run into a stairway that goes up, that it goes to the next level of the dungeon. But the idea with this is that the next level, the level of the dungeon it connects to might not actually be the next numerical level of the dungeon, right? It's that 1 to 3, and if you're screwing around and you're not paying attention, you may never reach level 2. You might miss out on an entire portion of the dungeon. But that's what that talks about. Right, same thing with nonlinear. Right, create circles and plot alternate routes throughout the dungeon. Right, so your dungeon's not fully linear. So we don't want to put, right, we have 9 chambers, and we don't want to be like you go from chamber 1 to chamber 2 to chamber 3 to chamber 4, right, and you just do it in a line. But make sure that there's ways that you can like go around things. You can not see things where you kind of have to spend time and effort and think about the layout of the dungeon to make sure as a player that your party reaches every nook and cranny of this dungeon. We talked about the 2+ exits. So this is an interesting one. There was a series of blog articles, maybe a decade ago. It's kind of old at this point. That talks about, I think the guy's name is Architect DM. Anyways, he was a person that worked in architecture, had an architecture background. He talked about the sort of things that he uses to design dungeons that make sense. So that's one of those. And Runehammer talks about it in one of his old videos, where he talks about like if you're making a door into a room, like if you think about the room that you're probably in right now and look at where the door is, like I'm looking at my door, that door is probably not in the center of the wall, right? It's probably offset to one side. Do that in your dungeons. The amount of dungeon rooms that have a door that open into the middle of it when it's not a sort of like big public space is kind of annoying once you realize that small detail. That this is how things are actually designed, from just sort of like how traffic flow and how people move around rooms. Because like if you have a door that opens into the middle of a small room, that means you can't put anything in the middle of the small room because that everybody has to walk into that space to reach everything. And a lot of these are from that. So from the architecture DM. Again, ceilings cannot extend more than 20 foot in any direction without support. It's important, like if you're making big chambers, right, we have down here, we got a bunch of big chambers. Put pillars in them. Put support columns in there. They can be used as cover, they can block line of sight, they can do all sorts of fun things, like put crap in the middle of the dungeon, right? Give them railings, give them stuff that they've got to walk around, like instead of just making a big square room for them to fight in, be like there's pathing, there's different ways, there's things you have to go around. And the next thing goes with that, make the pillars smaller than 5 foot, because that's one of the other big things that you see. To be like, oh, I gotta put a pillar in this room. Well, it's a 5 foot by 5 foot pillar. And it's like, yeah, but the room's only like 40 by 40. It doesn't need this gigantic pillar in the middle of it. Like, make small pillars that they can use as sort of like minor cover to get like that +2 to AC. Is really nice. Instead of just like giving them full cover. And then, you know, because you put like 4 of these in your rooms, like reducing the size of your room's effective play area, but by 20 by 20. Like, that's not great. And then the last part is sort of like the artificial dungeons, like that are created by people intentionally, should be compact, short. They shouldn't have long, and it's a very D&D thing, right? You have these weird winding corridors that like wrap around chambers and lead to nowhere. Like, don't do that if it's supposed to be a planned place. Like, people don't make things like that. That we only make about as much stuff as we need, and then try to like cut out as much of the sort of negative space that's in the middle of your dungeons. Like, if you look at old sprawling dungeons, they have all this weird negative space between chambers and corridors, and that's just not how people build things. So trying to sort of like compact everything as close and as tight as you can when it's a constructed image. Now, obviously, that's not something you do for like natural caves and things of that nature, right? And our this particular dungeon, like our iceberg dungeon, I think is kind of 50-50. Like, it's artificially created, but it's also hewn out of a natural substance, so you got to work with what you got, right? Because it's a subtractive creation rather than an additive creation, right? We're not building the structure, we're cutting out the structure. So it functions a lot more like a mine or a natural cave system, right? You have to go where the environment's going to allow you to make space and not collapse upon itself, right? So that's it. That's basically our things, and then we'll get down here to the assigned dungeon chamber list. But let's just go ahead and go through what we got right now, because we're on a little bit of a time crunch. We got less than an hour left in the stream, and I do kind of want to get through at least the mapping portion of it. All right, so we've got our entrance, we've got our antechamber, and actually I can just delete these as I go through them, which is usually what I do. Like, usually if like I have this piece of paper, you can see that I basically just like strike out things as I go through them. I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, as we assign things. So we've done our antechamber, we've done our audience chamber. All right, sleeping. That should be sleeping. Our sleeping area. All right, so what's going to come off of that? I think off of the audience chamber, I think it makes sense for the recreation area and the prison yard to be kind of close to each other. We still don't know really exactly what our fake creatures doing recreation area, which is something we probably need to figure out. If we continue the series next time, then we're definitely going to figure that out, what they're actually keeping prisoner. But I think that this audience chamber is going to go, and it's going to split off, I think. And I think up here, we're going to have the recreation area. Let's go. Like that. And actually, you know, I'm going to add an extra. Yeah, it's a little fiddly to kind of do it this way, but that's easier than, since I don't have a surface to kind of draw it out on. We're going to do our best. So we're going to have this recreation area. We talked about the recreation area being connected to the prison yard. Do we want that close to the audience chamber or not? It's a big chamber, so it kind of makes me think maybe it's going to be across the hall from it, which I think works. Right, so you can kind of instill where you think corridors should be. And of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that, like, if you take a left, there's the recreation area, and if you take a right, there's the prison yard. This could be up and down. We haven't really made that decision yet. That could be very interesting if the recreation area is actually on a higher plane than the prison yard. And just like, right, we could be like, this is the prison yard, and this is the prison cells. But we could also make the prison cells down here. Right, so that gives us an idea there, right? Either one of those can work because they basically mean the exact same thing, whether the prison, at least from our perspective right now, whether the prison cells are right here or they're right here, they mean exactly the same thing because we haven't created anything that's got any verticality to it yet. So just for now, is there anything else that I think would make sense to create? I think maybe the workshop. I mean, we did the recreation area. Let's go ahead and knock these out. So we did the recreation area. We did the prison cells. So I think if we come, actually, I think I'm going to make it like a little circle here. So we're going to delete these guys. Because I think after this, I think I want to make the armory as sort of the separation. That's really not where that needs to go. That needs to go up here. Say, I'm going to do that. Right, and then the armory, right, so that's sort of the difference there. So we'll kind of make a little, so this area we're going to make like sort of a circle between the recreation, the prison yard, the prison cells, the armory, and I think the workshop? Workshop or knowledge area? So I'm thinking either one of those kind of works. Actually, I'm going to change that. I'm going to change it. So I'm going to replace this armory. Replace the armory with the workshop. Because I don't know, this could be like a weird slave labor kind of thing, maybe? Maybe that's what they're using these people for. And so then they have sort of like a prison workshop thing that's going on where they're making license plates or whatever they're doing. And so that connects to the armory. All right, so that way we have a nice little circuit to kind of go around, which is one of the things we talk about over here on our 10 tips, right? If you want to create some circles, right? You could go audience chamber, recreation area, armory, and if you're not paying attention, you might never hit the prison yard or the prison cells if you're on a beeline. So that gives us our armory, and I think the armory is going to connect. It makes the most sense for the armory to connect to either the armory or the. So I think I'm going to make the communal sleeping. Like, what is this guy doing here? We're not sure yet, right? Schleppen. Communal sleeping. I think it like here, right? And these guys are going to be down here. Put that there. here. Right, and I think it makes sense for this sort of communal sleeping area to attach to both of those. Which leaves us only with the knowledge area. So we do know, which kind of screws things up. Like, was this person always alone? Maybe they're not always alone. Maybe they have sort of mind wiped people. They're sort of their servitor. Maybe like an aboleth kind of style, right? Where they just have some thralls. Maybe this Fae creature has some thralls. We need some creatures to go into this, so having a thralls might work. And you still have to provide for them. Though maybe they're just sucking from the same power source as far as survival goes. And so where does this knowledge area connect? Because I think that the knowledge area is going to be sort of like the central place where the power drawing is being done. And I think that makes sense on the other side of the armory. I think so. I think that makes sense rather than the other side of the workshop. And I say that because I think, like, if you did the workshop, you'd have all these prisoners that are in the workshop that could also walk over to that. And I'm not sure that that's a good idea. I think it's a better idea to have them off the armory, so there's sort of like a security checkpoint to ensure, like, people who shouldn't be going into the knowledge area aren't going into the knowledge area. So that's what we're gonna do. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we're just gonna do our knowledge area. So perfect. So that kind of gives us the basic mapping layout of what this thing looks like. And these could be vertical structures. Like, I like the idea that the prison yard and the prison cells are like way down at the bottom of the iceberg. Like, these are dark places, so that way you don't have to worry about like people jumping off the iceberg and trying to swim for land or something like that. Like, they're way down at the bottom. But we also have these prison cells, but also communal sleeping. So we have some people that are servitors and maybe some not servitors. I think we could play, if we develop the dungeon, we could definitely play into that being that the idea is that you bring in prisoners and then you convert them into thralls. And if we have a bunch of disrepair in the current dungeon as it is right now, the current status of the dungeon, I think it makes sense that something's gone wrong with the thralls. Maybe there's just prisoners, or vice versa. Who knows? That could be why we talked about another adventuring party being in here. That might be the reason why they're in there. Maybe they're on a totally different quest. They're not on the same quest. They could be literally in here to try to extract somebody who's been taken in as a prisoner. I do like that. Or maybe, right, we have this. We know that one of our encounters is a liquid pool with a boat hazard and the lockdown trap. I could definitely see that being the prison yard, and maybe you like row the boat into like this sort of like hidden waterline entrance into the dungeon that leads into the prison yard at the very bottom of the water. And then it's like, if people want to escape, you're going to have to dive into basically frozen water to get out. So nobody's doing that. But that does give us a fun thing for like the lockdown. It makes sense for the lockdown trap to be there. But of course, the lockdown trap I mean, the lockdown trap makes sense for the armory or the workshop as well, but not have the liquid pool doesn't as much. Yeah, but I think things are looking good. Like I like the idea that basically everything that's in this left and right vertical shaft there may actually be shafts, right? They may actually be vertical differences because we are talking about an iceberg, right? Which is, I think, in a lot of cases, just as tall as it is wide. Which actually maybe we should change sort of this beginning. That's not what I meant to do. Is to change sort of this entrance antechamber audience chamber area. And so I think what I'm going to do to give a little bit more of that verticality, even though it doesn't really matter. This is just really for my own sort of visual to maybe give like 2, 3, or 4, something like that. And maybe we make sort of like this, or maybe make sort of like the antechamber goes up. The entrance is actually up here. So you have to come in on sort of like the top side of the thing. It's one of the bad things about doing this is that I gotta fix like you have to fix everything, the whole layout whenever I change something. Okay, but I think I like that better. Like one of these, and then so it gives us this idea that there's a lot more verticality that's kind of going on. So you have to like come in on the entrance on the side of the iceberg if you take the original entrance, and then you have to, you know, take some sort of stairway or ramp or shaft or whatever it is down into sort of like the antechamber for the audience chamber, and then you pass through into that, and you pass through into this corridor in which there are, you know, stairs that go up again, and, you know, stairs that go down again, or maybe it's like a ramp or something like that that makes it really, really hard for like somebody who's in the prison yard to like climb it. Maybe it's super slick, like you're really not supposed to go that way, right? Because why would you ever? I really like that actually, because the idea that like if you were bringing in new prisoners necessarily, and you didn't bring them in through, we talked about sort of like the waterline entrance. So I think we need to do that. Because we basically have an alternate entrance at this point. So if you're not coming in through that sort of, you're not getting that rowboat in as a prisoner, and you come in through this way, which could be a real fun sort of like, oops, gotcha. You hit there, you see the ramp that goes down, you try to take the ramp down, it's super slick, it's not meant to go down, you slide all the way down into the prison yard, oops, now you're a prisoner. Boom, got him. Love it. So yeah, that's basically that setup, and I like that. So now basically, I probably shouldn't have deleted that list because now I need to put all this stuff together. That was less smart of me. Let's say, okay, so we got our entrance, we got our antechamber, our audience chamber. Let's do the top first. Let's do recreation area, communal sleeping, armory, knowledge area, workshop, and then we'll just kind of down again. So we'll do, no, let's go in order. That'll make it, I think, easier. got prison cells, prison yard, and we don't need to do the other entrance. Nah, I guess we're good. So we'll do the entrance water, and this is. Oh, actually, we don't need either of those because those don't have anything assigned to them. That's just That's just for us to know the point of entrance and exit for the place because they're not actually rooms in and of themselves. Okay, so usually we want to put our largest rooms, like we said, towards the center. Do we think there's more? I think it's more important to have a larger room. I think that 80/50 is going to go to the prison yard. That's one of our large chambers. I think we've got two 80/40s and a 60/60. I think the 60/60 makes sense for the recreation area. And I think one of the 80/40s makes sense for the workshop. We got an 80/40 out of here. 60/60 out of here. Alright, our last big one is we got another 80/40. What makes sense as another? I mean, obviously the audience chamber is super central. Or do we want to make this a 60/60? A nice square? No, I don't think so. I think the 80/40, making it a longer hallway, makes sense for the audience chamber. Perfect. Alright, actually, what we really should figure out is the 10/20. What is the smallest, absolutely smallest area in here? My initial thought is armory. I'm going to make it a very tight spot. It's either the armory or the prison cells. But I think if you're going to have a prison yard that's that big, you're going to have more cells. So I think that 10/20 is going to go to the armory. Like, it's a real tight, and it's a four-way intersection. It's a tight room to sort of like control passage and traffic through everything. So I think that makes the most amount of sense. You know, they have that much room to store stuff. I mean, most of these people should be under thrallship, and the rest of them shouldn't have any arms or armor. So if you needed to fight prisoners, you shouldn't need that much gear. Well, it could have been the antechamber too. I didn't think about that. Could have been the antechamber. Because antechambers tend to be relatively small. So we'll make that the 40/20. Alright, so of what we have left, what makes sense? They're all relatively similar. Two are basically the same size, and then one's smaller. So what would be the smaller? The knowledge area, the prison cells, or communal sleeping. I think by the nature of prison cells tend to be small and cramped, so I think we put the 40/30 in prison cells. Then we have a 40/50 and a 50/40 left. Doesn't really matter which goes where, they're basically the same. We'll say 40/50 goes here, and our 50/40 goes here. Again, because we don't, X and Y dimensions don't really matter. At this point. Alright, so we've got that. So let's figure out. Do we want to put? Let's put our stocking next. Right, I think we were pretty clear when we talked about it earlier that I think it makes sense for the sort of the final confrontation to happen in that knowledge area. I think it's the furthest point from the entrance, from either entrance, I think. Right? Yeah, just about. So I think that makes sense for that's the place where the boss encounter happens, right? Obviously, that's the place where the boss encounter happens. I think that's everything that we've built up to. That's what's leading up to. I think that just makes sense. So I think that that mind altering magic trick and creature, because we're pretty sure that this is the boss, is going to go here. I think that makes sense. Ooh, an empty room. That might be the most important. What room is empty? Ideally, I'd say probably either the prison yard or the recreation area. They're big rooms and empty rooms. I don't know. Maybe the workshop. Well, if we know that the boss Fey is in the knowledge area, it might. We have a trap, right? And I think if you're gonna put a place that's got, well, it's the lockdown trap. And we already talked about that. I'm just gonna use the liquid pool and boat. We're gonna use this number 4 here. We're just gonna. We already talked about it. I don't see any reason to go back on it. We're gonna slap that right down here on the prison yard. Boom, done. All right, a permanent spell effect zone that's a hazard. We talked about maybe something in the workshop, like something went wrong in the workshop. I like that. So I think this permanent spell effect and the hard encounter is going to be in the workshop. I like this treasure package that we've got up here with the jeweler's loop, with the preserved food and the notes and all that good stuff. I think this makes sense as the prison cells because I don't think thralls would have any personal items at that point. Once you're fully like mind slaved, I don't think that you would be carrying around preserved food because we talked about them not having food anymore or sort of carved wooden fetishes. And the idea is that if you get brought into the prison yard, I don't think that they're super keen on getting rid of the prisoner's stuff. I don't think that's what they care about because they want to enthrall them, right? That's how they're going to keep order. They're not going to keep order by making sure that these people don't have any stuff. They don't care about that. So I think all the stuff that goes here, this number 5, I think that makes the most sense down here in the prison cells. Boom. All right, what about the rest then? Is the rest of this creature and hard encounter? Because we just talked about that. We talked about the adventurers and maybe them. If they screwed up and slid down in the prison yard, that would make sense for them to be there potentially and have this stuff from number 7 there. So I think that works too. So let's do that. Oh no, sorry, we already did that. So where might they be? Oh, they could be anywhere really. I don't think they're in the antechamber, and I don't think they're in the audience chamber. So that leaves us sort of with the beginning. I don't think they're probably holed up. I don't want to put them in the armory because it's too close to where the bad guy is. But I do like the idea that maybe they took the wrong term, or maybe they're resting. Maybe communal sleeping. I think that makes sense for them to be communal sleeping then. So that may be where our other party of adventurers or whoever's got this stuff, whoever those intruders are, they're in this area. So that basically leaves us with a bunch of creature encounters, 3 creature encounters in an empty room. Do we have a room that makes the sense to be empty? I kind of want to put the empty room as the armory, just because doing a full combat encounter in a room that's 2 squares by 4 squares is a pain in the butt. And we don't have any hazards left. So I think the empty room's just going to be the armory. So then we have just some encounters. Where do we think the hardest encounter left should be at? I think first sort of immediate thought is to put that in the antechamber. I'm a big fan of sort of like bloodying the nose of the characters right when they get into the dungeon, to immediately kind of hurt them in the resources, right? And then put some easier encounters after that to kind of lull them. So you kind of get a little spike in combat difficulty, then you get a little and then spike and a little and spike and a little. But I think bloodying the nose right off the bat. It also works if you're familiar with the 5-room dungeon that we talked about earlier. The idea that there's a guardian, if there's something that stops people from getting in there. So I think that the antechamber, though it does raise some questions about how this other adventuring party, if that's what they end up being, got in here to that area. Did they find another way in? Maybe there's another secret hidden way in that we haven't thought about yet. And they've passed through some of these combats and didn't have to fight them. Or, right, we saw that skeleton, so maybe they killed some of them and ran off or something like that. That could be interesting. And then we have 2 of basically the same type of encounter. So they're going to go to our remaining rooms, which is the audience chamber and the recreation area. Boom. That's it. So that kind of gives you a feel of sort of like how this stuff starts getting put together. And kind of screw that up, and now we're fully into sort of like dungeon mapping at this point. So really the only things we have left are our dungeon dressing to sort of put things together. So does anything kind of jump out at us at first? So if we talked about those guys being in the communal sleeping area, if that's where our other adventures are, we want to put, I think it makes sense for the corpse and or skeleton to be in there. I mean, it's very stereotypical to put that in sort of like a prison cell. But I want to put it in the communal sleeping because it shows that like they've cleared out the area. And you can see that because there's literally bodies there. So we talked about them getting there. So I think crude graffiti is somewhere between the entrance that they may or may not have come into and there. But it also makes a lot of sense for the prison yard or the prison cells. Perhaps more. I feel like if it was useful graffiti, it would definitely be in the prison cells. But since it's just crude graffiti, I just put the thing on the wrong thing, didn't I? I sure did. I certainly did. I do not know what I'm doing. So yeah, I'm gonna put that actually in the antechamber. Well, no, I take that back. I'm gonna put it on the audience chamber. But this corpse and skeleton... Sorry, that's not supposed to be there. You're supposed to be down here. Duh. Okay. Unstable ceiling and floor. Where's a good spot for that? Ideally, I'd say probably one of the rooms that has a hazard in it, because that makes more sense. So maybe this permanent spell effect zone in the workshop? I think that's fine. Distant noises of creatures. Or creatures. That's something that I think works best if we put it in it very early. I think we put this in the recreation area to sort of inform our players, our party, that there are adventurers in the communal sleeping area, that they're nearby. So, not that distant, but, you know. Or maybe they're hearing something from somewhere else. Ooh, campsite remains. I think antechamber for sure. If we're talking about people making their way in and out, it's either that or the prison yard. Anything else make more sense than the prison yard? Not really. Let's do the prison yard. Boom. Alright. Vermin. Prison cells. It's gotta be prison cells, right? What says prison more than just a rat scurrying by, right? Absolutely. Vermin. Alright. So we've got some benign lichen, which could go in the antechamber. The armory. Or the knowledge area. Ooh, I think out of place furniture goes in the knowledge area. I think this guy, our Fae, has been so consumed. He's so consumed in feeding from the source that he has moved like all his basically his personal effects into the knowledge area. Like this is just where he lives now. Like maybe he was part of the communal sleeping area or had like some sort of portion of the audience chamber which were his sort of like private area, but now that's all in the knowledge area. Oh, that's campsite remains. That's not what I'm looking for. Did we do campsite remains? What are we missing? Okay. Oh yeah, we did campsite remains in the prison yard. Duh. Alright, so the last two we have are benign lichen, which makes sense for the antechamber. It's the part that's closest to the air. And for the armory. I think that's fine. So yeah. So I think hopefully you can see that by kind of making all these random element lists, we can then sort of thoughtfully put them together and sort of like fill in the gaps, right? We can kind of sort of like color in between the lines and try to make things work once we know what all the elements that are going into the dungeon are. And we have completed this. So we have our dungeon chambers. So we talk about filling in the details, which is one of the things we have down here. We also have our monster preoccupation. How much time we got left in this room? We got about 15 minutes. I could do monster preoccupations real quick, and then it just kind of goes into how to describe the chambers. Let's do monster preoccupations real quick. Very simple D10. So one of the things that I think sets a good dungeon apart from a not so great dungeon It's making sure that the monsters are doing something. So we'll just kind of go down the list and figure out what each one is doing. It's kobold. Probably not going to get to that. 3, they are handy. They're fixing stuff, maintaining gear. Actually, we're going to put that creature dash handy. So we know that whatever they're doing, they're working on something. 8. Work. They're doing some sort of work. 3. Yep, that's handy again. You'd think I'd remember that. Just rolled it. Study. I mean, you could assign this if you wanted to, like we did with the list earlier. I'm just, because we're kind of pushed for time right now, I'm not really doing that. So in the communal area, so that makes sense. So our adventurers are studying something in the communal area. Maybe some of that treasure they found. So we've got some guys that are arguing. Oh, so our boss is arguing about something? Maybe he's having an argument with himself. That'd be, or herself, or something in between. Because we, again, still don't know who our actual boss is. They could be having an argument with themselves, or one of their split versions. We talked about them maybe having a bunch of mirror images. It'd be really interesting if they were having this just gigantic fight argument between all the mirror images. And your party can walk in and be like, oh, this guy has absolutely lost his mind. Let's see. Alright, so we got argue again. That's what these guys are doing down here in the workshop. They're arguing. They're arguing too. Okay, that's enough ones. I'm gonna roll something else. 1 plus 1. Alright, food. So they're doing some sort of food thing. So in the prison cells, you have people that are trying to like scrounge for food or something. Whatever this creature is that's down there. Oh man, we have creatures. So we're in the prison cells. Check this out. We're in the prison cells. We have at least one creature down there, and they're doing something with food. This is also the exact same room that we put vermin in and preserved food. Maybe they're making real rat ratatouille. That sounds delicious. I'm so glad we did this. All right, and that's everything, right? That's all our. It's not bad guys. We don't have any other bad guys. That's done. Yeah. Okay. So we got through that. So we can just talk a little bit about the dungeon descriptions, and then we'll probably cast off for the evening. Thanks again for sticking around. It's been a lot of fun trying to go through this and try to make up a dungeon on your own. Of course, if you guys like this, we can put some polish on this, and so it's useful for you guys if you want to use it. Or I can do another one, or we can do a whole series and make a real big dungeon if you wanted to. But first, let's talk about sort of the dungeon chamber description steps that I find personally useful. And it's basically a 5-step thing, and this can be bullet points. It can be if you're the sort of DM that wants to craft your own raid aloud text for yourself, so you don't have to make that sort of stuff up on the fly, which I totally understand, and I definitely used to do that a lot. But now I do it a lot more, and I like the bullet point list personally for myself because it gives me more flexibility to improvise and change things around based off of what the players have done in the dungeon so far. But basically, it's just 5 very simple steps. So the first step is, what is the room's general purpose, the feel, and the size. The second is we point out sort of the obvious exits of the chamber and any sort of sensory detail to sort of build the atmosphere. That's what we have, part of why we have the dungeon dressing, right? That's part of our sensory detail. We note the room's dungeon dressing. We said that again, but they're not always the same. Sometimes they're different. And we'll see that. I'll read through the example once we get through this that I have below. And then the fourth is identify the room's primary point of interest. What is the thing that's important, the most important thing for the players to know about in this room? And then the fifth and final one is, of course, we ask the players to act. This is the what do you do step, or what would you like to do step, right? This is where it's sort of like the summary where we cut off from the read aloud text, where we're like, I have described this thing, I'm throwing it to you to ask questions, to do things. And so we have sort of the bottom, ruined armory. And so this kind of gives a very sort of simplified overview, a sort of a chamber description that I might make. So I have bolded. This is the ruined armory. The one room, right? The one DC room, DC 11. So if it's a simple thing, we'd bust that down to 10, 9, 8. So a DC 8 for a super easy task, and a DC 14 for a more difficult task. But in general, it's going to float around DC 11 for most things that your players are wanting to accomplish in this room or trying to do. All right, you enter a musty 40 by 30 ruined armory. Right, so we immediately said, okay, what is the room's general purpose? Okay, it's a ruined armory, and we know the size, and it kind of gives us a little bit of that feel, right? It's musty, so we know, and we know that it's ruined, right? We don't have to specifically say why it's ruined. People are going to have a general understanding of what that could be. Broken spears and other remnants of arms and armor litter the floor amongst the broken stone. That's our sensory detail. There is an exit in this room, but we haven't talked about it yet because it's not an obvious exit from where they're coming in. In the hall behind, you can hear the sound of the complex settling, whining as it shifts. So you can hear this sort of dungeon kind of, it's got that old sort of creaking vibe to it. And right, that's the dungeon dressing. We had one of those where you hear a distant sound of a creature. Well, another one of those is distant sound of the dungeon itself. And this would be that entry. Where like, oh, you just hear it, like it just makes noises like a haunted house kind of thing. At the center of the ruined armory is blocked by a rubble of a half-collapsed ceiling. Right? Because we have a hazard in this room. So we're introducing the hazard of the room. Searching through the rubble, you feel the tiniest of moving airflow, and assuming your players have light, with light you can peer through a crack in the rubble to spot a reinforced wooden door behind the barrier of collapsed ceiling. So we identified the room's primary point of interest. Right? The primary point of interest is basically that there is rubble that's blocking the room, and there's a reason for you to get onto the other side of the rubble, however you do that. So this is a really great thing, and then we ask you, what do you do? Right? That's the fifth. Our little call to action. Like, all right, I have set up the room for you. Ask me questions about the room. Make actions in the room. Investigate things. Do things. Now we have what we've set up as a tiny little keyhole that we can basically, a pinhole, that we can see that there's a door on the other side of the rubble. So if we have a druid, they can wild shape. Well, they can like scurry through that as a mouse or something, or a spider or whatever they want to wild shape into, and that's a cool like little highlight thing they can have to check out that door. Also, that the door is barred from this side, so the side that they're on, and that's an important key detail depending on what's going on in the dungeon. Other things like if they have Misty Step or some sort of dimension door or teleportation or something like that, they can immediately skip across that barrier. Things. Otherwise, maybe there's like a little small skill challenge where they move stuff. This is where we talk about, you see in the section right under this, we talk about wandering monsters. And I don't really want to get into that because we've just got a few minutes left in the stream. But the idea is that with Wandering Monsters is that anytime that the players stop making sort of forward progress or they stop to do something that's not basically getting in a fight in the dungeon, there's a chance that somebody's gonna come across them. Hi, Holy, how are you? Nice, from Germany? Awesome. We're just kind of finishing up the stream right here. We were doing the dungeon creation. I was going through a series of things, so we've got a sort of dungeon creation process here on the side, and then our simple dungeon design that we've been working on. The VOD for this is going to be up afterwards, so don't worry, you can catch it later if you want to go through the whole thing. But we're just kind of finishing up right now, talking about wandering monsters to drop in our D&D dungeons. So basically, we use wandering monsters anytime that the players basically stop making forward progress in the dungeon. So if they stop to be like, well, we're going to completely move this entire barrier so we can get to the door on the other side. All right, well, anytime that you stop in the middle of the dungeon, there's a chance that monsters from the dungeon are going to run across you. And so that's right. That's why they're there. Yeah. Yeah, why not use mimic? Well, the thing is, the mimic's actually behind the challenge in the room, right? The challenge is that there's a barrier of stone in the room that's keeping them from the door. Now, if I was super cruel, I'd be like, yeah, you spend all this time to get through the barrier, and then on the other side, there's a door that tries to eat your face. But really, we're just talking about why you might want to include wandering monsters. And if you guys like this series, this will be something that I might pick up or do another dungeon later. Like I said, polish off this dungeon. And we'll talk about that next time. But yeah, that's sort of it. Like I said, kind of dropped in right at the end, but that's great. There's plenty more stuff down here, right? I've got other tables and other things, but we're not going to go through that right now. We achieved the goal that we were trying to do, which was to make this simple dungeon over here, a dungeon for 4 level 12 PCs in D&D. And then we would just need to flesh out sort of the details and try to figure out, the quests and all that. Oh yeah, we're doing a lot of homebrew around here. Always good stuff. So yeah, that's sort of that's I think where I'm going to probably end up closing out on this stream. If you want to catch more of this stuff, on Sundays I'm spinning up a solo D&D 5e adventure. We made sort of the basic sort of sandbox. It's gonna be a hex crawl kind of stone. Oh, perfect. Thank you for the follow. That's great. Like I said, come back, check the stream schedule we're gonna do on Sunday. We've set up sort of the little mini sandbox that we're gonna do the sand crawl in. I've made a character and a sidekick for them, and we talked about sort of like the setup for it. So this Sunday we're gonna jump in with the very first sort of session, dealing with the character and her sidekick, getting into the adventure and getting it started. Oh no, absolutely understand. Yeah, time zones. Yeah, kind of a pain when it comes to Twitch. Like I said, but the VODs will be up, and so you can always grab those whenever it's convenient for you. And the VOD should still be up for the last character creation, so if you want to check that out, you can do that too. But that's it. That's it sort of for me today. Thanks for everybody who jumped in, who kind of came along with this ride, asked plenty of questions, talked it all out. Next time that I have a D&D game canceled, I'll probably jump into another one of these impromptu streams because they're a lot of fun, and go over whatever I've been working on in the background, prepping DM resources and all that good stuff. But again, thank you everybody that showed up. Make sure you check out the VODs. If you want, you can hit me up follow me on Twitter, Red Ragged Fiend, all that stuff's at the bottom here. Or hit up the website, which has a blog on it. I've been doing blogging for about D&D and other TTRPGs for about 10 plus years. A lot of homebrew and interesting stuff that's really great for people who want to get a little bit better at being a dungeon master, a little bit better at game master, and kind of upgrade their games. But that's going to be it for me. So, oh, you too. Thank you, Holy. Perfect. You guys have a great day and or night, and I will see some of you on Sunday, and for those of you that I don't, I hope to catch you next time that I'm on at this time. So love you guys. Good night.